Hello, everyone. If you don't mind taking your seats. Can you hear me okay? Hello. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Cole Akers. I'm a curator at the Glass House. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar but also new faces. Just as a matter of business, please silence your cell phones before we get started. And I want to thank Crystal Chumney, Lisa Oldham, and everyone else here at the library for generously collaborating and hosting this event, and also to the New Canaan Community Foundation for their really generous support of tonight's program. I'm really honored to introduce Greg Goldin and Sam Lubell, the curators of the really illuminating exhibition Never Built New York, which is on view at the Queens Museum through February 18th. So if you haven't gone, go see it. The show presents 200 years of visionary architectural and urban designs for New York City that never came to be, brought to life with original drawings, renderings, newly commissioned models, and 3D visualizations. My personal favorite is this really exquisitely rendered Elliott Noyes Westinghouse Pavilion proposal that's a bounce house. That's by far the best. Sam and Greg also curated Never Built LA, which you see here. This is William Pereira. They'll talk about that. That was presented in 2013 at the Architecture and Design Museum in LA. And each of them have their own curatorial projects to their credit as well. So Sam curated Shelter, Rethinking How We Live in LA, also at the A&D Museum. And Greg organized the Getty Museum's No Further West, an exhibition about the making of LA's Union Station. They're also both wonderful writers. Sam is a contributing editor at the Architect's newspaper and has written several books about architecture. He also writes for the New York Times, the LA Times, Architectural Record, and other publications. Greg was the architecture critic at LA Magazine from 1999 to 2011, and his writing similarly appears all over, including the LA Times, Architectural Record, Zocalo, and many others. So please join me in welcoming Greg and Sam to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Cole, and thank you everyone for coming tonight.
Yeah, great to see everybody.
I'm Greg.
I'm Sam.
And all right, we can go now. So here we are.
Yeah, do you want to start about?
Yeah, we thought we would begin with the very concept that got us both involved in this subject. It began as Never Built Los Angeles, but it's really about looking at cities through the lens of propositions that were never realized, propositions for buildings, propositions for freeways, propositions for parks, propositions for sports stadia, if you want to get formal about it. And it's the what if. It's the way of contemplating a city in all of its various aspects through the possibilities that were never realized, and that gives you the opportunity, we think, to reconceive the city that you know as someplace that it could have been.
And it also gives you the opportunity when you're looking at, is this working okay? Yeah. Okay,
Works
great.
For me.
Great. The idea of Never Built, it sort of captures people's attention. Even just an image like this can really capture your attention because you're dreaming, like Greg said, about what if. And a friend of mine put it a good way. A mutual friend of ours was asking him, what is it about this topic that gets people so excited? He's like, well, duh, it's about dreams. And that was it in a nutshell. It's about the dreams that never happened, but it's about how we all love to think big, how we all love to dream and create possibilities. And so it's not necessarily, although these things never were built, it's not necessarily a depressing thing. It's actually, in a strange way, a really uplifting thing and exciting to see the way people kind of imagine the world. Even if it doesn't happen that way.
Right, and there's probably no better place to begin than where we began. We began with, in some sense, this image, although that's not an exact truth to how the story really begins, but this image is the one that somehow or other caught on. When Sam and I began researching an exhibition in Los Angeles, which eventually got to be titled Never Built Los Angeles, we came across this drawing at the Los Angeles Flight Path Museum, I believe is what it's
Flight
called.
Path Learning Center.
Flight Path Learning Center.
Horrible name.
Yeah, you can't barely pronounce it. And it's
Great place, though.
in this little one-story, low-slung, glass-enclosed building on the south side of the Los Angeles International Airport. For any of you people who have been there, you know it's one of the most awful places in the world. But it just so happens on the south side of the airport is this gem, this little collection of every uniform that stewardesses and captains wore for all of the airlines that had gone in and out of Los Angeles over many, many decades, and an archive. And we were specifically looking for a needle in a haystack, which we do all the time. Show us the stuff that never got built. What are the propositions? And we came across this William Pereira proposal for Los Angeles International Airport. What year is this? About 1952 or 53?
Yeah,
He was working with his students at the University of Southern California, where he was teaching architecture at the time, and they conceived of this dome that would have been a grand concourse for LAX. And naturally, we fell in love with it. What could be better if you know LAX and then you see this, you go, what if? Yeah, okay, what if?
Yeah.
And here it was. And the moment this image got out into the whatever that sphere is, it took off. It became this what would you call it, a marquee for exactly what our notion of never built is all about. Here is a grand proposition, and all you have to do is land at LAX to ask yourself repeatedly, why didn't they do this?
That is true. That is very true.
So that's where it all kind of began, in a sense, philosophically.
And certainly, yeah, it's Never Built's about the dream and about the kind of grandeur of these images. And it's about the images themselves. This is a beautiful rendering done out of Pereira's office. You can see where's the little thing? That's the guy's signature there. We don't even know who it is.
Many times we try to find the people who draw these things, but that's even harder than finding the architect's drawings, for anything.
And a lot of times the architects, but it's just the
Yeah.
beauty of the drawings, and it just captures your imagination in so many ways. And in a way that if this were ever built, it never would capture this kind of feeling. And that's that's the beauty of it too. It's the pure conception and the dream, as I put it. So then when we started investigating. So it started as a very narrow, supposed to be a very small show about a few buildings, and as we started digging through archives and talking to experts and looking in magazines, we started realizing that we had to push further back, and we started looking at projects that weren't just cool buildings or like a piece of architecture that, we're looking at things that would have absolutely changed LA fundamentally, the way it actually functioned, the way people saw it. And this is an example by Frank Lloyd Wright's son, another theme, by the way, of people that don't get their due. If this had been built, this is downtown LA, right along Grand Avenue, which is Grand Boulevard then. But
No, he just wrote it down wrong.
but it's a civic center for LA that he actually drew this for the Los Angeles Times, and sort of he and his father were both very interested in sort of the Mesoamerican kind of architecture. Frank Lloyd Wright famously did his textile block, NS House and other houses of that style. But this would have been that on the scale of an entire city, basically. It looks like a temple complex, kind of incredible unified whole for the city, and in some ways so monumental that it's terrifying. But in other ways, it certainly would have changed the city drastically. There's no way you can doubt that. And you see there's speedways here, there's walkways here, there's helicopters and planes up here. Every level of this thing is thought out and clearly planned.
And if you know Los Angeles, if you do, show of hands, you will see right in the center there, point to the center there, Sam.
The library?
That's the existing Los Angeles Public Library. So it gives you some sense of the scale of this, but keep going.
Yeah, and then do you want to talk about this?
Sure. Well, Los Angeles is notoriously the automobile city. And this is a map of the proposed subways from 1929. And you know, this is what these sort of investigations lead you to, because here is a map that would have remade the map of Los Angeles. There's no question about that. In the late 1920s, you could have built these subways for a nominal amount of money. Most of this land was nothing but plats that were unbuilt.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have just changed the way people get around in LA. It would have changed the whole layout of LA. Everything would have gone, you know, in a denser pattern along these lines. Just would have changed everything.
Yeah, I mean, the whole cosmology of the city would have been different. And I can't remember any more accurately how many miles of subway was this, some crazy number.
A lot.
A lot. A lot. That's the technical term. And the cost would have been minimal, but the Los Angeles Times, which essentially ruled the city, discouraged voters from approving the bond issue for it because they said they didn't want Los Angeles to become like New York City.
Or Chicago.
Or Chicago. So down it went in flames. And now, today, they are following very similar routes to some of these right here at $1 billion a mile to build a subway.
Yeah, it's going to take,
which will take them, I
gone.
forget how many thousands of years to complete. So, next.
And we're all familiar with Central Park by Olmsted and Vaux, Frederick Law Olmsted. But his firm and this firm of his sons worked all over the country, including in California, Palos Verdes,
Oakland,
also Oakland and San Francisco,
Golden Gate Park.
But they they also worked in Boston, the Emerald Necklace, which this is actually the closest plan to. This is a plan for interlinked park plan. Presented to the Chamber of Commerce. When was it around? Like
1929, a magical year. Parks, playgrounds, and beaches is what it was called.
So all these are parks in LA, and if you've been to LA, and you may not, people who don't know LA, there's Griffith Park, there's a few major parks, but overall, LA is the most park-poor city in the country. This would have changed everything. You would have had parks and parkways connecting them, green parkways, sort of like the Merritt Parkway, that sort of thing near here, connecting all these this kind of emerald necklace of parks all across LA.
And every mile of beachfront would have been a public park.
Yeah, it's a major.
No development on the beaches at all.
On
Period,
and on
full
and
stop.
on. Chamber of Commerce, the day this was released.
Yeah, they printed it and they did not release it. They put it into a vault and never said another word about it. Scout's honor.
And it would have taken, it took half a century, and a friend of ours.
Yeah.
Was it?
I don't know if it was Bill or if it was Mike. Either
Davis.
Mike Davis, who wrote City of Quartz, or William Deverell, who's a historian at USC. One or the other of them discovered this thing.
At like a used bookstore or something.
I think it might have been Mike. I don't remember.
And they wrote a book about it, and now we know about it. But this had been gone for half a century.
More than, yeah.
And this is my favorite title for the most apt title we've come across. The Causeway, an unusual feature. This is a plan for Santa Monica, if you've ever been. This does not exist, obviously. This was called the Santa Monica, well, many names. Santa Monica Offshore Freeway, Offshore Causeway, the Causeway. Essentially, this was a freeway on a chain of islands, man-made islands, that would have stretched from Santa Monica, which is here, all the way up to Malibu, which is here. Instead of taking the PCH, you'd take a freeway. You wouldn't really have a beach anymore, or you wouldn't have like an open beach anyway. And the effects of this, just the effects of how this would have impacted development going forward, this could have been a model that would have gone all the way down the coast. Who knows what this would have done? I mean, this is a major theme, the domino effect, we like to say. But it just in itself, just astonishing. And the amazing thing about this is this went through the legislature, all through the 60s, right?
Yeah, until it was finally
For almost a
dropped.
decade. This was approved by the legislature, and it was vetoed by the then governor, Pat Brown, the father of the current governor, Jerry Brown. So those things come around. But this was not pie in the sky. And another thing that Never Built's reveal is the conventional wisdom and the way people are thinking about what is possible and what is normal changes drastically. The fact that this was, I mean, I think if somebody proposed this now, they'd be laughed out of the city, but this was very, 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 very close to happening. And So you wouldn't have just had a different city, but if you start, studying these stories, you see how times change.
Yeah, the ethos definitely changes.
Yeah, and that impacts things.
And if anyone, by the way, you go back just one thing, if anyone can decode the language that they're using for these islands, we'd like to know.
Yes.
We don't have an answer.
I like this Crab Island.
Yeah.
Then in 2013, the book and the show for Never Built LA came out. This is one of many, many monorails, by the way. It was at the Architecture and Design Museum, which at the time was right across from LACMA, which may be on the site of a future Never Built.
Since torn down to build a subway stop.
Yeah, that's true. And then it was laid out on a geographical plan, so you're basically walking through the city on a map of LA, going from the west side, which is closer to us, to the downtown, which is down here. Here's the little monorail that we had going through there, which was fun. And this tower, which is another Lloyd Wright project for the cathedral that was never built in LA, made out of 65,000 Legos?
65,000
Yes,
Legos.
a lot of Legos.
Yes.
So, but a fun, when you're talking
Built by a
about,
high school student.
yes, an amazing high school student. Now he's a college student,
Yes,
architecture school student. But the idea of dream transfers well into building it into a reality of a show, because you can do whatever you want, because it was never built. And it is about dreams, and people really responded to that. So then we moved to a new place, and that brings us to New York.
We knew which was the second city.
Disagree. But anyway, New York, right on the heels of that, we decided pretty quickly that we wanted to look at a city that had the most concentration of talent and the most concentration of ambition, and we knew that we wanted to do New York. And our publisher pushed us to do it too. And then we found a museum, the Queens Museum, which we will talk about. But the plans here and the ideas here go back obviously further. I think the furthest back we had in LA was what, like 1900?
Yeah, approximately.
And in New York, they go back basically to like 1811. We could have gone further.
We
than
could
that.
have gone further, but that was the first thing we would do, 1811.
Yeah,
Or maybe
and
1809.
Also, you'll see the density. Obviously, Manhattan, LA, you had things one here, one here, one here. That layout was like New York, and the way we designed the show later, you'll see much denser, and not just the landscape is denser, having to deal with new problems of density and space, but also the ideas are denser. Everything, each site has like 5 or 6 ideas going through history, and it's all about layers and compression, and I think that has a real impact on just the city itself. These ideas just whirring back and forth. So this is one of the earlier plans from the late 19th century, and this you can talk about some of the themes that are behind this plan. This is a plan by a man named Samuel Freed, plan for Coney Island called you can see the Steel Globe Tower in Coney Island. Greg, take it away.
Well, Sam knows this project better than I do, other than to say that, partly what we found very inviting about this was the image, which the only image we have of it actually is a little postcard. Yeah. But it's compelling in its own right. Of course, it captures that feeling of Coney Island, and you think, what a great proposition. And then, Sam, who did the research on this, little by little, as he teases out the information, it turns out to be his name shouldn't have been Samuel Freed, it should have been Samuel Fraud. Because...
Wow, did you just think of that?
What's that?
Did you just think of that?
No.
Oh.
Because that's exactly what it was. And this is something that occurs a lot with never built propositions. You can fall in love with an idea, and it's very seductive. A lot of drawings are very seductive, but behind them is nothing. It's hot air. In this case, here was a guy who was going to build this steel thing that he orders the steel for which he cannot pay.
Yeah, they built foundations. They raised millions of dollars. They sold stock, and then they took off.
They took off.
And I don't think Freed ever got arrested, but the treasurer was arrested and convicted of embezzlement. So that's one of many reasons that things don't happen. Is just they're not intended to happen.
But it's it is an age-old theme, and it is one that when you look at cities in general, this provides a really good example of very often with cities. That's exactly the story that unfolds. That there are people who gin something up simply to fleece the public or fleece investors, they disappear, and all that's left behind is a 3x5 postcard with a dazzling image.
And it's a compelling idea. And I honestly, there's
How
not.
cool would it have been? It'd been great. Everyone would have loved this.
It's a compelling idea, and that's what sets any idea. That architecture at the end of the day is not necessarily just about what you build. It's the ideas behind it. And sometimes they get built, and sometimes like this, they're never intended to happen.
And this is the first time I'm looking at that. I actually see that it's got the Leaning Tower of Pisa in the middle.
Well, it's got a lot going on in there. We could go out. This could be the whole hour.
Yeah. Next.
And then you have plans that really, and we can talk about a few of these, really are meant to challenge the whole notion of what the city is about. And this is a good example. This was at a time around the 1920s, when the city was growing into this kind of crazy, untamed metropolis that people had never seen before. And this sort of represented here, the cacophony of towers and the mess of urbanism and
this is
wars.
almost at the pinnacle of the skyscraper wars.
Right.
The last true skyscraper is the Empire State Building. They barely got in under the wire during the Depression. Everything had stopped a year later than when this was proposed. So it's a monument. It's not a skyscraper. It's the complete opposite.
And you get Broadway becomes this golden boulevard with this holy light becoming, sort of this antithesis of what's going on in the shadows around it. And it's this European conception of a city of monuments and these grand axes. And that's an important distinction because that's not what was going on. But this was a World War I memorial, about twice the size of the Washington Monument, but not too different, built on landfill at Battery Park by a guy named Googler.
Eric Googler, yes.
Who,
everything at the foot of it, I don't know, Sam's better with the pointer, but everything down here, that's all landfill. So everything roughly from the foot, you can't really tell, but there's two armillary globes at the base and just below them. That's all landfill out into the harbor. It was meant to be the way in which New York was going to greet all those dignitaries who came to Manhattan, and then they could parade right up Broadway. It's, as Sam says, it's completely the inverse of how the city developed, where it was headed, and
but it's something we see over and over. People try to un-New York New York. They try to remove the grid. They try to lift buildings above, and it very rarely works. And sometimes it takes decades, but then it gets undone. But it really very rarely works. Another good example.
Much earlier,
around the time of Central Park, mid 19th century. You want to talk about this guy?
Well, let's see. Because now, of course, I'm drawing a blank. These are Richard Morris Hunt, who. What building would you know? Well, the Met. If you know the Met, its original facade, not all of it, but the central facade was designed by Richard Morris Hunt. He was the first American to travel to France to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. He is the first probably truly trained American architect in the 19th century. When Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted designed and laid out Central Park, he became apoplectic, because he regarded this clearing in the distance as the exact inverse and opposite of how a true city should function. You couldn't have this blank spot in the middle of the city. It needed to be lined in some way with transitional spaces that paid homage to what the city was, but at the same time let you pass through them. And so he said, you have to have these gates, these monumental gates. That's the only way Central Park is going to work.
They also happen to be quite neoclassical.
Yeah.
And you can see that he sort of made New York look at, to me it looks a little bit like Paris. He sort of had an image of creating a completely different...
Yeah, with these, ostrich feather fountains and, this rostrum. Now that, by the way, is Columbus Circle. So You're down in the park, you're looking up at Columbus Circle.
Not the Bastille.
But what's that?
Looks like the Bastille a little bit.
Yeah, oh, that's right. It looks like the Place de la République. But so, you get this really classical idea. And these were going to be not just at all the corners, all four corners of the park, but there were going to be several of them along the southern edge, the eastern and western edge, and the northern edge. I forget how many altogether. Each one in its way was going to commemorate some important event in New York history, not all exactly at this scale, but of a similar kind of grandeur. I think luckily for us, Vaux became incensed at this proposal and battled it to a dead stop. The two of them had these public battles in the newspapers, writing copious, long missives to one another and to the public about whether it was a good or a bad idea. And eventually it was withdrawn because the park commissioners had approved this. This was a go. And these drawings, which Sam has seen in person, we couldn't bring them from the Library of Congress to the show. We had to reproduce them. But they're exquisite and they're enormous and they're
exquisite.
They're knockouts. But, bad idea.
So, yeah, good drawing, or good painting. And then we talk about the congestion and the issues of space in New York, specifically in Manhattan. And this is probably the most dramatic version of efforts to fight that. So this looks like Manhattan. This is a plan proposed in 1930 by a man named T. Kennard Thompson, consulting engineer, a very, very well-known civil engineer at the time. But this is actually a plan for a city of New Manhattan. So this is Manhattan up here, and this is City Hall. This is the Battery where we just were. This is all a new city.
Now you begin to get it, don't you?
Yeah, it's big. It's very big. And this was a plan that that he shopped for quite a while, I think for about 3 decades. And his scrapbook at the New York Public Library is full of these articles from the New York Times, from every publication
Tribune,
imaginable,
the World.
the Journal, the World, the Herald, everybody. And caught the imagination of these kind of newspaper artists, which is another great way to look at unbuilt projects, is to see the artistry of kind of these unknown, amazing artists that worked for newspapers and magazines at the time, able to put in these Jules Verne-esque dirigibles and amazing other things. But this is an amazing example of this effort, and it also indicative of a time when we thought engineering would get us out of would work and kind of pave the way for anything. We built the Panama Canal, and we're damming we're putting up the Hoover Dam, and we're doing these amazing things, and damn it, we're going to build a new city, and nobody's going to stop us. Again, if somebody proposed something like this now, I don't think it'd get in every major paper in the city. I think,
but it wasn't madness.
Metro desk would laugh them away.
Yeah, but it's not madness. Kennard Thompson, he did all the calculations. He was a civil engineer. He built the foundations for many of the tallest buildings in Lower Manhattan. He knew what he was talking about. And this sort of landfill was a perfectly reasonable proposition from an engineering point of view, and no different than, look, Hudson, as we learned from our good friend Bill, Hudson Street in Manhattan, that was the border of the island. Today it
was on the Hudson River.
Yeah, it was on the Hudson River. The rest of it is landfill now, today. So the notion that you could double the landmass of Manhattan, it wasn't that cockeyed.
Yeah, and you're still building your cities. You gotta plan for the future. Back Bay as well in Boston, and a lot of Boston all built on landfill. So not that far-fetched.
And people fell in love with it. I mean, every newspaper covered this for years and years and years.
And another effort to what can we say? Another effort to take advantage of all the space in Manhattan and to keep people from commuting to Queens to take a plane was this plan by a developer named William Zeckendorf. His family still works today, and he was he's involved in some of the biggest developments in our country's history, not just in New York, but he had a plan for an airport. Just so happened to be on the Hudson River. This is looking south. It's about the size of Central Park, 40 blocks and 50 blocks. And what can we say? It's insane, but it's also something that wasn't considered completely a joke. This was on a spread in Life magazine. He knew how to get press, and he also was so adept at it that he made an enemy of a person you don't want to become an enemy with, which was Robert Moses. And Robert Moses very quickly laughed this project off, said it was ridiculous, which it very well may have been, but it really didn't get the time of day. We had letters in the city archives going back and forth, and Zeckendorf became very frustrated because every one of these imaginative plans that he proposed would be shot down very quickly by Moses. Zeckendorf hired I.M. Pei as his first job out of Harvard. I.M. Pei worked for Zeckendorf for about 8 years. You'll see some of his proposals as well. None of them happened, and I think a lot of that has to do with Moses.
But you know, the underlying point here is, yeah, you could look at this. Of course, in its way, it's a delightfully insane kind of image and proposition. If you had encountered this in reality, it would be really a dead space for the island. But at the same time, he's trying to answer a question that people have tried to answer over and over and over again. How are you going to get on and off this island? How are you going to have transportation that gets you to and from? How do you get onto an airplane and get there closer and faster? No one's come up with a good answer, but
you still have boats, still have the piers, still have the highway. Yeah, that's good.
It's not. So, yeah, next.
A little bit of problems with pollution and sound. And
Yeah.
So another solution to the crush of congestion, obviously the subways. That was a big, but that didn't happen until the turn of the century, early 20th century, and this was a plan from the 1870s that was very, very extremely close to being the first subway in Europe. Actually, technically it was because it was built for about 1.5 blocks, 2 blocks. But this is a plan for a pneumatic system running on air, literally pushed by a steam engine. Or by steam fan.
Yeah, compressed air in a sealed
man named
tube.
Eli Beach. He was the publisher of Scientific American.
Founder and publisher of Scientific American.
Yeah, and he literally built. First he built a replica of this at the Armory Fair, and then he actually kind of secretly built this under Broadway between Warren and Murray Streets, which is right next to City Hall. He got a permit to build a pneumatic system, because these were common, pneumatic system for packages, which were all over New York at the time and everywhere. But he secretly built a subway, or a pneumatic subway, for about 2 blocks. We've tried to find this unsuccessfully, by the way. It's there somewhere. There's some footing for it somewhere.
Yeah.
But anyway, and this went all the way to, this is an example of politics, because this went all the way to the legislature. The Beach Pneumatic Bill, it was called, to fund this. Was actually eventually passed by the legislature, but once again, you have a governor who vetoed it, and the governor, and there's a lot of, we don't know for sure, but the idea is that he was very much allied with Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall was allied with another plan that also
they were backing elevateds,
and so neither of them happened. But obviously, an important never built would have fundamentally changed the way we work. Elon Musk working on the Hyperloop now. This is essentially the same technology, very similar anyway, about 100 and how many years later? 150 years later.
Yeah.
And this is how it would have worked, essentially going through the tunnel under Broadway here. So this would have been your subway. And then we also have plans that really would have formally changed, we think, architecture.
This is the Museum of Modern Art, in case you don't recognize it.
It's a firm called Howie and Lescaz.
Yes.
They built the PSFS building, the first modern skyscraper in America in Philadelphia. But this was a few years earlier.
And as you can see, I mean, the formal proposition here, which is these staggered boxes, each one was in a way a light box. They were intended as gallery space, and they could admit different levels of light into them.
Right.
So that
the point is you have exposure on all sides. That's
right.
What the cantilever does.
Right. And
it's glass block along the side, and then a scrim on the top.
Correct. And what can you say? I mean, this is modernism in its probably most profound and interesting form at a very early point. What year is this? 1930?
30.
Yeah, right about that time. And it was just too bold for the directors at the Museum of Modern Art, and instead what we got was Edward Durrell Stone's rather building. And we feel very strongly that had the museum embraced this architecture and gone forward with it, it would have had a ripple effect through the city. Not only would these architects themselves had had an opportunity, much the way that, we talk about the Bilbao effect with Gary's, museum in Bilbao, Spain. If you can imagine something similar, which I think would have been true for this, suddenly the tone of modern architecture in Manhattan and probably throughout the entire country would have been changed. This was an avatar, and it just went nowhere because the people behind it didn't have the courage to go forward.
Well, and yeah, that domino effect. If you think about, oh, this building didn't get built, that's a shame. But then when you think about, as Greg was saying, what the ripple effects would have been, and your brain starts to go in crazy directions. You just realize how different things could have been, especially for a project as important as this. Another project I think
we love this one.
Equally iconic is the Met Opera and Lincoln Center. And this was the designer, his initial plans. This is Wallace Harrison, who doesn't get the credit I think he deserves. Built a beautiful church not near here in Stamford that you should check out. It's called nicknamed the Fish Church. Yeah, amazing.
Also, a really beautiful one up in Buffalo, though.
Yeah,
the temple there is exquisite.
And of course, they built the New York State Plaza, Empire State Plaza, et cetera, et cetera. And the UN, they oversaw that. But anyway, the plans for the Met, about 50 iterations that were much more structurally ambitious, and much. He was very interested in thin form concrete, which if you go to the Fish Church, you'll notice, and if you go to this temple in Buffalo, you'll notice sort of the expressive qualities of concrete and concrete becoming its own structure. In this case, the structure becoming what we call the foot. So these are toes, and this is the ankle, and there's the foot. So the fly loft is an ankle of the Met.
But by the way, you only see it in this one drawing. When you look at the other drawings, it doesn't come across quite as anatomical as this.
But each one is in its own. One looks like the Sydney Opera House. One they're just so expressive. And then you just you get politics, you get bureaucracy, you get the board at Lincoln Center, the board of the state's arts board, Rockefeller, everybody has a say, and what you get is the most simple form of this.
You get bland.
You get a square box, which I actually still like, but very different from this, and again, a different type of architecture. This type of structural architecture and very kind of, I call it flamboyant structural modernism, much more common in places like Latin America, certainly Brasilia, places,
Mexico.
And Mexico City, but much less of it, especially in New York. But this would have probably changed that, I think. And then you get plans that would have been, what can we say, disastrous.
This is the Lower Manhattan Expressway. This is Paul Rudolph, who's maybe unrivaled as an architectural renderer. His drawings.
He was the chair of architecture at Yale for a long time, nearby, and he built the Yale Architecture Building.
Yes, the drawings blow you away. And of course, you want to believe in the drawing, but then just plant this thing on Broome Street through through Greenwich Village, and all of a sudden you're going to agonize over why did we do this?
So this is a very late version of Moses' initial plan.
Right. This, interestingly enough, was commissioned by the Ford Foundation. After Moses couldn't get his plan through to ram a freeway across Lower Manhattan, the Ford Foundation came along and asked Paul Rudolph, well, can you give us one that we might be able to build? And he conceived this thing, which he called Mountains and Valleys. It's a little hard to see at this end. We're at the Hudson, that's the...
Holland Tunnel.
That's the Holland Tunnel. As you look across, you're at the Williamsburg and the Manhattan bridges. And
at least you get your housing back.
Yeah, you do get your housing back, right? You tear down everything along, that stretch of, you bulldoze everything and you build up. And the reason you call it mountains and valleys, as you can see, it has these peaks, and then it goes back down to a lower level. And then when you look at the rest of the drawings, it includes every imaginable aspect of a city. In a sense, it is a linear city with everything from people movers to these incredible loop-de-loop car parks, and it goes on and on and on. I mean, in its own right, it's a delight.
Oh, the drawings are second to none. And they're at the Library of Congress.
but it tells you a little bit something about the ambition for city making, that it can be completely off the rails and yet be very convincing. And this is part of that process. These kinds of drawings have a way of convincing people that it's appropriate, it's right, and we fall for them.
Yeah, that's true. But what I think is important about the lack of the reason they didn't build this was because this is what separates Manhattan and New York from almost every city in the country, which is at the time when the Freeway Act was passed and they were building freeways, almost every major city in the country had a freeway built right through it. Philly, where I'm from, LA, where Greg lives, Dallas, St. Louis,
Detroit,
every city,
Chicago, Boston.
everywhere. And while there were freeways built through all the boroughs besides Manhattan, Manhattan did not get them because of people like Jane Jacobs who fought this project. And you also had proposals for the Mid-Manhattan Expressway, which at one point was going to go through the buildings in Midtown. But it's the
Just
same thing.
burrow right through them.
Same thing right across the island from the Lincoln Tunnel this time to the Midtown Tunnel and going through the buildings on 30th Street and then up. And Moses wanted to build a parkway going through Washington Square,
Park.
which at one point had existed, but he wanted to basically bring that back through the arch. But the fact that these things didn't get built, you have this continuation of the fabric and the energy doesn't get divided up. It doesn't just stop it from taking out parts of the city, but that division that it creates and that sort of barrier that it creates really hurts the core energy that a city has. Also, I see a freeway, it's like a sign saying drive. You have the freeway, it's like, okay, we should be driving. Whereas now people in New York don't even think twice. I don't own a car, like why? So it's just a totally different way of thinking, and it would have changed people's mentalities and completely. So those are another. Okay, and then we get into
Here is IMPay.
and Zeckendorf.
Yeah, so Zeckendorf, this is, I think, the first major thing that IMPay did for Zeckendorf. This, believe it or not, is what, 1954?
Yeah.
This is called the Hyperboloid, and it would have replaced Grand Central Station. So here's, right, we moan now because we've fallen in love again with Grand Central Station.
But you do like the image, right?
No.
Maybe not. Okay, not everybody likes it.
Not everyone likes it. But the reality was in 1954 that the railroads could no longer support Grand Central Station. It wasn't paying for itself. It was suffering. Ridership had severely declined. The station wasn't functioning. And so this was a way to do something with what they thought was an asset that had failed.
And you could take advantage of the air rights above it. That's the essential part.
Right. So that prompted this kind of proposal, which in its own right, whether you like the architecture or not, I mean, we can disagree or agree about that, but it's a very forward-looking piece of work. And what can you say? You just say, yeah, glad that wasn't built because now we do love Grand Central Station again.
Yeah, and although this is so far ahead of its time structurally and just the way, the way it looks, as you could tell, this is IMPay, I think the peak of his genius.
This is a remarkable work, very early on in a great architect's career, it's work on paper.
But that idea of air rights above Grand Central, so this plan didn't happen. Essentially, the chairman of the railroad, Robert Young, whether it was related to the railroad about to go bankrupt or not, he committed suicide. That's essentially was the.
He didn't commit it when he saw this drawing, though.
Essentially, that was the nail. That was the last straw. We'll put it that way for this project. But another plan that was trying to take advantage of the air rights above Grand Central was a plan by Marcel Breuer, the designer of the Whitney, now the Met Breuer, along with Pirelli Tires not far from here, and so many buildings that we all know.
You can see the station in the drawing on the right. You can see right there. It's
the first version would have gone jumped right through the Grand Concourse of Grand Central. The second version would have just destroyed the front facade. So pick your pick.
Right.
But this one's essential. This plan, which again, the developer, the railroads and the developer they were working with argued that they had the right to build above their own station. They used their own air rights. But the newly passed preservation ordinance said, no, you can't do that. And that was passed as a result of the loss of Penn Station, another major, obviously,
Huge blow to the city.
huge blow. And this went all the way to the Supreme Court. They fought the ordinance to the Supreme Court, and preservationist side, and the ordinance, the New York City Preservation Ordinance won. And essentially, that's what gave the preservation movement in the country real teeth, legal teeth, that
Yeah.
precedent.
And this is what, 1967? So this is 13 years after the IMP, and they're still
Oh,
looking for a way.
There's so many. There was also a bowling alley that was proposed for the concourse, the Grand Central Bowl. So many plans for Grand Central.
Yeah.
So we're lucky that that didn't happen. It's a miracle. I say that anything gets built, but in this case, it was a miracle that this didn't get torn down because the writing was on the wall, but it didn't. And then
Here's the opposite.
the opposite.
Yeah.
This is an example of projects that the number one reason projects don't happen, money, not surprisingly, and the number one killer of architectural projects en masse is recessions, or in this case, depressions. This is the Great Depression. This is a plan for the Metropolitan Life. This is the MetLife building, you may know, in Madison Square Madison Square Park, rather. This was going to be right next to it. This is the same Metropolitan Life North Annex, 100
and something stories.
Yeah, over 100 stories. Harvey Wiley Corbett, who worked on Rockefeller Center, you can see the similarities, and Daniel Everett Wade. But it was, the plan was stopped because it was planned in 1929. You had the crash. But it wasn't stopped for good. This plan was just chopped off at about 30 stories. So if you go to Madison Square now, well, here's another project, but you'll see this is the base.
There it is, right there.
That's the base.
And go into the lobby. There's two lobbies. The lobbies are on a scale of a building that should be more than 100 and something stories tall. And with all of the grandeur, the eloquence, and you know, that feeling of space, and all the elevator banks and everything, except that it just stops where all that mash of, you know, air conditioning equipment is on the top of what we call the stump.
So, and they actually had reserved the right to build on top of this eventually. Yes.
You go into that lobby, in the screen in that lobby, there's a front page of the New York Times.
Right.
Dated November 1st, 1929, announcing the world's tallest building.
Yeah, there you go.
20 stories.
Right.
Yeah, there you go.
There you go.
That was it. And the Great Depression killed it. And then this building here, designed by Daniel Libeskind, called One Madison. This project, which featured these spiraling gardens, which would have brought public space into private space and kind of rethought, I think, the whole idea of a skyscraper, which is very rarely accomplished. This was killed by the Great Recession. So it's kind of interesting. Same area, you have these back-to-back projects. And then right next door on 22nd Street, about a block away, Rem Koolhaas's plan for 22nd Street. This is 23 East 22nd Street.
Right.
Another plan taking advantage of air rights. This actually kind of cantilevered over and stepped over the air rights of the building next door.
Right.
This plan was killed also by the Great Recession. These things do come in waves for sure. But also this idea of air rights in New York just keeps coming back. And also brings on, I think, some of the most interesting architecture and how to deal with that. And that keeps going and keeps going. This is the most recent Never Built we could find. This was not in the book or the show, but this is a plan by Thomas Heatherwick for a pier by Barry Diller right off near 14th Street. This was
partially paid for by Barry Diller. Is he here tonight? No. Okay.
Darn. But this was about a month ago. And you
died a month ago.
Okay, are you going to go into the water and build new parks? This idea of running out of space, thinking of new ideas, and then they die, will go on forever. And then we, of course, since we were talking for the Glass House, we wanted to mention a few plans by Philip Johnson.
Yes,
So
this is his plan for then Idlewild, now JFK Airport. And this was a competition which he lost, I think, to IMP, didn't he? There's a few things, I wish I had brought it with me. What he wanted to do with the airport was to create a grand concourse of the sort that you have. In fact, he speaks specifically about Grand Central Station and how you have this sense of arrival and a sense of departure, and how that's really missing with air travel. And so he wanted to conceive this structure that would give you that same feeling. And you don't see it from the exterior here, but under that undulating roof is one continuous, there you go, one continuous long concourse that that Johnson felt would give you that sense of that moment of I've arrived, or that moment of, you know, departing to take an airplane. It still had the romance that some of us may recall, rather than the, I don't know what it is, the were schools of fish. So that was what was behind this plan, and what made it so interesting is this structural element where he was working with a structural engineer to bend and twist this roof in 2 dimensions to give it that undulating and moving sensation.
Another
of a
important theme of Never
a
Built
wave.
is that when you get, this is very innovative, and people
Very.
didn't necessarily know how to do it, and that's often the reason why things don't get built. Unfortunately, the most innovative projects, because they're not mainstream and because people haven't figured out how to do them or can to pay for them. That's why we love. That's why Never Built, we get to show the very most innovative things, because often they don't happen.
It was a good plan.
And then this is a
yeah.
plan
Back
back
to
in
Washington
Washington
Square.
Square. There's the arch. This, if you know NYU at all, this is the Bops Library that he designed. This was a plan for what he called the Galleria, which was, this is a street, by the way, now. This is Washington Place, just to the east of the park. He was obsessed with the Galleria in Milan, the covered arcade. He wanted to create one for New York, right here. And here's a better view of it. This was NYU's version of the Galleria.
It's made with the same sandstone that the library.
Yeah,
had.
it would have been,
Yep.
would have continued that language, that red sandstone, all across the park.
Yeah.
It would have had these sort of, also these are now, these are now historic buildings. He would have kind of unified it, I don't think in a better way, with these kind of block-like sandstone covered buildings all around the corner here. That plan didn't happen. A lot of it was the furor over that library that he was building, sort of dissipated the energy, but he did the whole master plan. He was working on the whole master plan for NYU at the time, and very little of it actually happened, and this probably would have been the centerpiece. And then you have monumental structures, brutalism. You all know the name brutalism, but it was more than just brutalism. The word is from Breton brut, exposed concrete. Concrete. It's not just brutal, but it's also the idea of strength, showing strength and power to the rest of the world, and that's what this sort of represents. This is a plan near the rail yards in Chelsea, actually right near Hudson Yards. If you've been to what they're doing there now, this is essentially the same site of that. It's called the Chelsea. What is it called? Chelsea. Drawing a blank. Another brutalist kind of block mentality.
Yeah, this is more Corbusian, but this is Welfare Island, aka Roosevelt Island.
Not Philip Johnson. This is Victor Gruen.
No, this is Victor Gruen. But we thought we would show you, how what Johnson was proposing was a language that was very common at that period of time. This was the idea of what do you do with any kind of given space? Why you put up slabs?
But also, I like how the representation of this reminds me of that shot we saw of that obelisk. And this time, modernism is sort of the peaceful, sort of
Yes,
ordered idyllic reality. Although in reality, this would not be idyllic at all.
And there's
but
smokestacks
compared to the dirt and dust and
you
craziness
can see the
of
smoke
New York.
just coming right out of the power plants. Of
So that
Manhattan.
idea continues on through different styles, but it's always this sort of ordered versus the chaos of New York.
Yes,
the chaos of New York almost always wins.
Well, and embedded in the drawing is that very ideology. Is this proposal is clean, it's new, it's fresh, and what's in the background? This decaying, filthy, smoke belching city that we're opposed to.
Yeah, I like the smoke. And
Back to
then
Philip Johnson.
back to Philip Johnson, Ellis Island.
Yeah, this was his ziggurat for Ellis Island. We'll show you one other thing from Ellis Island, but the federal government almost sold off Ellis Island in the 1950s.
After it was decommissioned.
Yes, it was no longer functioning as, the entry point for immigrants. And they kind of came to their senses, and by the mid-1960s, they decided we need to do something to create a monument here. And Johnson was commissioned to do just that. And so he designed this ziggurat, and I forget, I used to know how many miles that walkway is. I think it's like 3 miles around the perimeter. And as you walked, it was going to have inscribed like all the names of the immigrants who come into the United States. It's actually, architecturally, to me, it's not a particularly engaging proposition, but it had some interesting ideas in it. And then he was going to, around the other buildings, this garden, you can't tell, but it was meant to be in a state of desuetude. So it was going to be kind of a crumbling ruin through which vines would grow. And he had this notion of this kind of contrast between this ziggurat that represents the ages and this, place of entry which was going to be allowed to kind of disintegrate. So it had in it a kind of, what can you call that proposition? I don't know, but
Yeah, it's almost like theatrical in my opinion.
it is. Yeah, it is very
History
dramatic.
is theater. But
Yeah.
we also have, speaking of drama, another earlier plan for Ellis Island.
This is Frank Lloyd Wright. This is probably the last project that he ever worked on. The key plan for Ellis Island. This is in the 1959 when the island had been, was technically, I guess, was it formally deascensioned by then?
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of what they had done. It was up for sale. And
This was the highest bid.
this was the highest bid. The developers who were behind this were prepared to pay the highest amount of money, and they went to Frank Lloyd Wright, and he, along with some of his students at Taliesin, devised this city on the 27 acres of Ellis Island. And if you know the Marin County Courthouse in just north of San Francisco, it's very much that late phase of, well, it would be late, of Frank Lloyd Wright, where it's almost intergalactic architecture.
If you have been to the Marin County Courthouse, by the way,
It's really cool.
it was actually served as the model for Naboo on Star Wars, which is interesting. Because George Lucas his ranch was
He's near
right
there.
near the Marin County Courthouse, passed it all the time. So for real, this kind of architecture, but it's sort of this sort of futuristic but also ancient kind of feeling that he was evoking, perfect for things like that. He was also working on a plan at the time for Baghdad, a whole new master plan. He was very interested in plans from the Middle East, and you can see a lot of that kind of influence as well in this and in Marin. But also the density of this is kind of astounding of this plan. This would have been housing in the middle and all these different, every one of these kind of bubbles
Yeah,
had a
what was the
different.
number? Something like
It was about twice as dense as Manhattan.
Twice as dense as
Which
Manhattan.
makes you rethink, because he's known for Broadacre City, which was a utopian scheme for living for a mass housing that would have been based on cars and would have been very not dense at all. But in reality, a lot of his schemes like this were extremely dense. So he had a whole gamut of plans, and he wasn't just like people say. I think he's anti-urban. I think he's different plans for different locations, and this kind of points to that. But he was living at the plaza at the time and sketched this out on a napkin. We have the napkin in our show, which is great. And the plans he
a
died
true
before
napkin
this
sketch.
This scheme was done, and his Taliesin Associates actually finished the drawings, which are quite impressive drawings for this. And then back to Philip Johnson.
Times Square.
And you may know about the kind of controversy over the AT&T building that Philip Johnson designed. They're threatening to well, and some would say deface the base of it. We'll see what's going to happen. But he was working in that kind of, what can we say? This is almost
Language.
This is a very classical language for skyscrapers. This is a plan for Times Square that he had, with these mansard roofs and bringing this whole language of kind of Napoleon III to a skyscraper, essentially.
And then it gets lampooned in
Well,
the middle.
the later
drawing.
plan would have been all. This is the first plan, and the later plan was more the time, late 90s, or excuse me, was it early 90s, late
Yeah.
80s, early 90s, as high tech as they could go. A lot more digital display, more kind of Times Square appropriate. neither of these worked. And then this is a plan, you can mention that.
Well, this is Venturi Scott Brown, who were, I guess, I don't know whether they invented it or not, but they're the great postmodernist architects, and they decided they would thumb their nose at Philip Johnson by planting this, very big, the Big Apple, right in the middle of Times Square, to, lampoon his design.
I think it's also like this is a caricature of what we think is a caricature. They thought these
of our own
buildings were a
work.
caricature.
Right. So it's a big wink and a nod and a
Yeah.
ribbing all at once. So it really is internecine warfare among architects, but
So-
it provides enormous entertainment to people like us.
Yes. So we could go on. Obviously, Philip Johnson. Again, this is where we get the most fertile minds and the best. The people that come out with the most ideas also have the most unbuilt ideas, and he had a lot. But we also, as these themes go, you have plans. You have this domino effect that projects would have had. You had dealing with space. You had so many of these themes come up. One of the most important themes that we've come up is the idea that these ideas don't actually necessarily die. These ideas get passed on. Even if they don't get built, they show up somewhere else, either by one firm to its own work, by a firm to another work. And that's really is the essence of Never Build, is that these ideas are what's the most important thing. And architects we've talked to left and right, we're teaching a class, we talked with Daniel Liebeskin, and he said, you can't, so many plans don't happen. You have to love these ideas so much because you can't expect them to happen. You have to be happy that you even created that idea, because so often, about half the time almost, these major plans
More
at
than,
least
of
won't
course,
happen.
yeah.
So it is about the idea, and it's about perfecting that idea. So that we talked about the
Right.
hype. We talked about
There's Hyperloop 1870, Hyperloop 2017.
yeah, very similar technology. We could go into the details. I had to
Yeah,
do this
you
in our
don't have to
class, but
go.
they're actually quite similar.
Yeah.
And this is a description of building the tunnel, the test tunnel, which is about 2 blocks. And this is Elon Musk in LA right now, building the test tunnel for the Hyperloop. Literally building that now in South LA. And then you have a plan for the IB Museum by Diller Scofidio and Renfro. This was in the early 2000s, kind of this folded plane that continues down. And then this is a plan for Columbia University Medical School.
Yeah, just go uptown.
You certainly see the language, so maybe it did get built in some way. This is a plan by Shop Architects. This is a plan for the Museum of Sex. They were kind of cheeky, this whole idea of being able to see but not see through, and see people moving through the building. This is their plan for FIT, Fashion Institute of Technology, which is now getting built. You can definitely see the similarities, and it's this whole idea, again, this idea of people, the promenade of people through space that you can watch from the street, this voyeurism, and also this sort of translucent and transparent and opaque, which obviously makes a lot of sense for a fashion institute as well, these themes. So they find their proper place at times.
Or improper. Yeah, this is Stephen Hull's
Parallax
Towers in the Hudson River. It was really, I don't know whether this was a serious exercise or not, but it's at 72nd, right in the Hudson. And then if you flash forward.
Well, so the idea is take advantage of all the spaces that usually get ignored. So you're building
Right.
off of the river, but you're also connecting towers and taking
by
advantage
bridging
of
them
lateral
together.
space between the towers.
Yep.
So then you get his scheme for the World Trade Center competition, which he worked on with Richard Meyer and Peter Eisenman. You can certainly see the similarities there. It also had the added benefit of these cross bracing, literally serving as structural support in case there's, sadly, for security reasons, a totally different reason, but after the attacks of the World Trade Center makes sense. And then again, this was finally built, a similar scheme in China, outside of Beijing. This is a plan called linked hybrid. Instead of having horizontal elevators like the Parallax did, you do have
Moving sideways.
you have walkways going through, but the idea still stands, and the energy going through these buildings and building a community, and it's something that he held on to the idea, he kept perfecting it, and
Or worsening it.
or worsening it. Daniel Liebeskin, the same. His spiraling green tower then went on, at the World Trade Center. That didn't, the
thing.
Freedom Tower then that idea kind of moved into this one Madison that we looked at, and now it's actually being built in Toulouse in France. There's a tower with a spiraling garden going through. This is a plan by William Pereira, the guy who we talked about before, worked on LAX.
This is ABC Tower for New Manhattan.
Yeah, and the plan,
And then-
the idea was to converge a television antenna with the skyscraper.
Right, and this is one of, I don't know how many of these. He made countless drawings for this project, all of them moving toward the direction of, ta-da, Trans-America Tower, San Francisco,
Yeah.
you know,
So
6 years
this
later.
got rejected, and then this idea, the head of Transamerica didn't like any of their schemes, and sort of in desperation, they pulled out this. We talked to them about
Yeah, these
pulled out this
leather-bound
old scheme,
books. Leaf
and
through them.
They loved it. So whatever Transamerica tells you on its website, which we checked, which says nothing about this, they talk all about how it lessens shadows on the street, but it's really a rehash of essentially of a plan that was planned for somewhere completely different. And then this is a plan. We mentioned the hyperboloid by I.M. Pei, and this is a tower in Doha, Qatar, kind of mimicking the Olympic flame. It's called the torch. It's like nicknamed the torch, and you can see why. But you can see the similarity is unmistakable, and certainly this sort of steel exoskeleton around the side. The cores are slightly different, but the idea is very much the same. Whether or not this is intentional, we have no idea. But these ideas filter through, and you know they're just in the water in architecture.
In the air.
In the air, I guess. And this is a plan by, we're not going to get into politics now, but this is a plan by Donald Trump for the New York Stock Exchange.
The
at
world's
foot of Wall
tallest
Street.
tower.
Again, the world's tallest tower, tapering obelisk. And then if you look at the current One World Trade Center, you can't help but notice the similarities to some of the forms, the beveled edges. The top is not, however, as thin, and that's actually intentional. These are the new plan for the towers meant to recall the original Twin Towers silhouette. Otherwise, who knows, maybe it would have been exactly the same. But these ideas are out there. You know, these ideas are everywhere.
Sports stadium down there next to it?
Oh, this year? That's a very good question. I don't know what that is.
There's supposed to be a sports stadium on the west side.
Oh, no, this is on the east side.
This is on the east side.
But we do have, that was a plan by KPF, same architects, by the way, as this.
Same architects.
For a Jet Stadium and Olympic Stadium on
Right,
the west side.
that's the one.
Where Hudson Yards is now,
Yes.
yeah. Another never built, yeah.
Never built,
Yeah.
exactly.
So that brings us to the point, we had a show in LA, and for us, the ultimate, we did a book, which I don't think we have copies of, but we're happy, it's certainly out there. I think we made a mistake not bringing books, but anyway. The ultimate manifestation for us is to build an exhibit, and that's the three-dimensional realization of these ideas and really being able to experience it in a really architectural way. We have the show currently up until February at the Queens Museum in Flushing Meadows, Corona Park, the site of the World's Fair. This is the centerpiece. The Queens Museum's like here. So this is the main lobby. This is the panorama of the city of New York, which is the largest architectural scale model in the world. And it's a model of New York City that was built for the '64 World's Fair.
Right.
And you'll see we use that, which is nice. No, that's the Museum of the City of New York, I think you're probably thinking of. This is in Queens, right on the site of the fair, so in Flushing Meadows,
Yeah, it's in
Corona
Flushing.
Park. Not just beyond the tennis center where the U.S. Open is played. And this is the overall conception. Let me just show. You have the one gallery, which is the Rubin Gallery, which is sort of all the historic artifacts. This is the panorama we were talking about, and this is the central space. So the Rubin Gallery is laid out like New York City. And essentially, you walk from south here to north through the city, through Manhattan, because the gallery is shaped a lot like Manhattan. But we also wanted to capture this density that we keep talking about, and this density of forms and this density of ideas. And it really, our designer, Christian Wassman, I think, captured that extremely well. And then in the
Right,
panorama,
we want to make what are largely two-dimensional drawings palpable and give you the sense of how could the city have worked if these things were realized. And that's how we try to use space three-dimensionally to make that
Here's
happen.
that Richard Moore's son, by the way.
Yeah, there you go.
Walking through it really is like walking through New York, walking through Times Square. But then you go around a corner and you get into the panorama, and then you're like a bird looking down, or like an astronaut, whoever, looking down on the city. And we worked with students at Columbia GSAP, their graduate architecture school, and they built about 50 of the never-builts into the panorama.
To the same scale as the panorama itself.
Yeah, and they're lit from within with LEDs, or at least they were. Hopefully they still are.
Yes, we hope.
They had some electrical issues, but anyway. But really to capture, you can see, you've learned about all these projects, and you can see how they would
You
have.
can point some of them out. There's
Sure.
the Zeckendorf Airport, the big flat slab
That's
there.
it's hard to miss. That's the Lower Manhattan Expressway.
The big thing. There's the IMP right in the middle of the city, right
That's the
there.
hyperboloid.
Yeah, there's the obelisk down in the Battery.
That's Trump's obelisk. That's the World War I obelisk.
Right.
This is the Frank Lloyd Wright
Ellis Island.
Ellis Island plan.
Bit overexposed.
This is the
in the
gondola
photograph.
that was going to go to. So you on and on and on and on.
Yes.
So, but really an exceptional way to get a sense, not just of the Never-Builts, but of the city. If you've never been, of the city of New York itself, and it's just an exceptional place to be. Is the panorama? I really
Yes.
can't recommend it enough. Finally, in the panorama, we also have an element of virtual element of 5 of the projects that we recreated in virtual reality that you can sort of experience with goggles. It starts out, you're in a spot in New York that we videotaped with in 360, and then it dissolves into these projects. This is the airport, again, that Zeckendorf Airport. This is looking at it from below where the ships would have gone in.
A very idealized version of this.
Yeah, that's true. And then finally, we mentioned, did we mention this?
Cole
Yeah,
mentioned
Cole
this.
mentioned
this
it.
is the wonderful bouncy
So this was the
castle.
original model, which SF MoMA has. We couldn't get the model. This is Noyes.
This is Elliot Noyes with
In his house,
model.
I believe, in his house in New Canaan.
Yep.
And I think, actually, yeah, he has a lot of history. I was in Litchfield, and they had a big, I know he built the library there, but there's also like a big statue. I don't know, his family, I think, goes back a while here. But anyway, a genius designer. We could not get this plan. And to talk about this plan, this was for the 1964 World's Fair for the company Westinghouse. And essentially, each one of these, you would have gone in a moving walkway inside this steel disc, and on a moving walkway with a glass wall here. And you would have passed each one of these bubbles. And inside one of these bubbles, you would have seen a piece of Westinghouse's business, of what went on there. So kind of exceptional.
Yeah, they're innovations for the future.
But since we couldn't get the model, so we
built our own.
Yeah. And that's inside the main space. It's called the Skylight Gallery. Also in the Skylight Gallery, it's all plans for Flushing Meadows Corona Park. So we have plans for the United Nations that they wanted to put the permanent home of the UN there. We have lots and lots of plans for the World's Fair. We have a plan, again, another one by Breuer over here that wanted to build sort of an Olympic park that would have hosted Olympics and other major sporting events. But the centerpiece, we needed a centerpiece for this. And we needed something that could be pulled out quickly because they have events, they have weddings and other events. So our designer geniusly, we wanted to do a big model of this. Our designer said, why don't we make it something you can deflate and take out? And that's how we got the bouncy castle.
Yes, but what do you have to be under, I forget what age or
Under 5 feet.
Under 5 feet tall.
Yeah.
Otherwise,
So it's,
you're not allowed in.
Although we did do it once.
We did do it. We broke the rules. But yeah, it's a genuine bouncy. Bring your children, grandchildren, or anyone under 5 feet tall. Go enjoy yourselves. And thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Happy to take some questions.
Yeah, let us
Go
know.
back to the book.
We'll open to a few questions if you want, if you're curious.
Give us just a moment, and do
Sam,
you want me
wanted
to turn on
put
your
the
mic
book
too?
cover back on.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the first question up here, and Cole and I'll
Oh,
be
yeah.
running around. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and then we'll have to head out.
Thank you. For some of the late 1800s and early 1900s, I presume they were designed with existing technology. Did the designers figure that for later things, technology would have to be invented to actually build their stuff?
Boy, that's a tough one. I think like most of us, you're not contemplating the future quite in that way. What you find is you'll find early propositions for skyscrapers, let's say rather than the 1880s. And there were architects who were looking at steel as a way to build rather than using cast iron. And so for them, that was the model of the future. How that could be, how that would in some way be a rampart or, hedge against some other innovative technology, I don't think anyone could have conceived. But so I don't really know how to answer that other than to say that I think that architects in their moment are working in a way that they think is incorporating the most advanced materials.
And sometimes that like Frank Lloyd Wright is probably the best example, in that people didn't always know how to build the things that he was proposing, and they would fail. They would leak, they would crack, they would.
Right.
And sometimes we don't know if he even really cared that much, but he
Probably not.
certainly wanted to innovate, and that had its costs.
I was just thinking that it's nice and easy to build a 2-foot balsa wood model,
Yes.
but when you go to 1,000 feet, what do I do now?
Sure, and that's why things don't get built a lot.
Right.
I remember that earlier you had asked if anybody could decode what the causeway in Unusual Future
Oh, yeah,
said.
okay, good.
I decoded it. It says oil, and on the outside of the word oil, it says W. It says the letter W and H.
Okay, I see the oil.
And at the
oil.
other end, W, and then
W.
closest H.
H.
Oil.
Okay.
Well, there you
Okay,
go.
very good. You go get yourself another cookie.
Yes. Never built MVP.
Right.
Could you stay on that
Yeah.
slide?
Sure.
Advent of global warming, these concepts are doable.
Yes.
Important to protect.
Correct.
That's true. Got a marina.
Yes. I think what you say is undeniable, and it's true, and we wouldn't approach it necessarily in this way. You know, you would probably see it more as estuary or whatever, you know, the actual landscape had been, you know, and evolved
right.
over time. But I think you're absolutely right. And I think in that sense, yeah, this looks kooky to us. It's a freeway. But in fact, these are going to become necessities for...
And I think then the idea was we're going to conquer nature. Now it's we're going to work with nature. So if
Right.
you built this, you'd build maybe a park, and it'd be a biome, and it would kind of, you know, naturally defend against things. You wouldn't have a freeway probably going through it. Yeah. And that was sort of, the freeway was the ultimate sign of, you know, progress then. But the idea is there. Yeah. You're going to be seeing some of these things soon, probably. Something similar, yes.
And in some ways, you know, it's a very tricky proposition, this one and any other that you're going to look at for purposes of protecting our shorelines, because the entire Santa Monica Bay, that beach there, is man-made. And the Army Corps of Engineers dredged Santa Monica Bay. I forget how often they come and they import sand, because these are not naturally occurring beaches. The naturally occurring beaches are a very narrow band. They're, you know, 10 or 12 feet wide, and the Palisades just go straight up from there. So it's what you say is quite astute. It's a question of how are we going to approach it.
This may be true of most places, but New Canaan has its share of never builts as well.
I'll bet. We want to know all of them.
And one of them was the hockey rink, which was going to be built on the campus of the St. Luke's School, which would have bankrupted St. Luke's, and we would have a town rink now, but no St. Luke's. And of course, the massive proposals for the Hoyt Farm in the eastern part of town, which had any number of proposals for the use of an enormous piece of land. So we have our share here as well.
Well, you know, you bring up something really important. Sometimes these never-builts engender enormous opposition. There's one we didn't show you of Louis Kahn and Isamu Noguchi for a park up in Riverside Drive, and the neighbors became so angry over that project that they went after this woman, Adele Levy, who had donated the money for it. She was a well-known advocate for orphaned children. You couldn't find like a more perfect person to be giving money for a playground. And they so viciously pilloried her that finally, you know, the architects and her family gave up. So you'll get that. The other side is there are built projects that bankrupt.
A lot of them.
Well, I think that's exactly what's happened with Cooper Union, right? It's essentially, didn't the Tom Main thing?
It's debatable, but that's what
But
people
that's
have
what they
said.
say, is that school has been bankrupted by building Tom Main's, you know, new building there. Yeah,
Yeah,
well,
they naturally
and the
do.
Los Angeles County Museum of Art is endeavoring on what will be close to maybe $1 billion plus new museum. And before they've even built it, before they've even done anything at all, they've already raised their prices for admission to the museum. And the likelihood is they'll go belly up before they even build the thing, because they don't, you know.
So we don't judge. Never Built's not art. People ask, like, did you put in your favorite stuff? We're not judging whether we think these would have been good or bad. We just want to show things that would have been impactful and would have changed this place for better or for worse. And I think that's for people to
Right.
decide. Whether
And
they
so
think-
here you are in your own community with these kinds of, their dilemmas.
we just want you to think about it. That's what we.
Yeah, there's someone over here.
Okay. So I was curious, what is the most outrageous design that actually did get built, in your
Ooh,
opinion?
most outrageous design.
Of
that
all
got
of them?
Built. Yeah, what, that Herzog de Meuron stack of money
That's
that
a
Bill
really good
likes?
question. I mean, there's some stuff now. We talk about these islands. I don't know if they're outrageous, but they're pretty crazy. These islands out in Dubai that are man-made islands shaped like the world. One is, and one is like a giant palm leaf. They're ambitious. They're ambitious. A lot of the ambition going on now is not in our country. The most ambitious stuff. Some people would call it ambitious. Some people would call it insane. But it's a fine line. But I think people will say that a lot of in the architecture world that the most kind of searing ambition is not in our country right now. We're sort of, I think we've taken a step back. We're a little bit more conservative about what we do. Whereas places that are now trying to make a name for themselves, that are establishing themselves in the Middle East and China, they're the ones that are doing some of the. You'll start if we do a Never Built there, we'll see some pretty cool stuff.
I'm curious. I think one of the online flyers for this event showed a dome over
Oh, yes.
part
Oh,
of
yeah.
Manhattan. Can you tell us anything about that?
Sure.
What do you want to know? It's Buckminster Fuller, who you know is a geodesic dome, immediately comes to mind. And this was a geodesic dome 2 miles across and 3 times the height of the Empire State Building. And it would have spanned Manhattan sort of at about the center line would have been about 42nd Street. So
Yeah,
part of it
Midtown.
would have, Midtown, so part of it would have
Up till
actually
Central Park, basically.
covered a little bite out of Central Park at the northernmost, and I don't remember where exactly the southern edge would have been, like 23rd, somewhere like that, and then river to river. And boy, I mean, you couldn't stop us talking about, was this a serious proposition? I don't think so, but it was Buckminster Fuller playing around with serious ideas he did have about geodesic domes and notions about biospheres, and could you put a lid over a city, and would a lid over a city do what he thought it would do, which is to create its own climate, which would have, he claimed, would have been more energy efficient, a more temperate environment, fewer extremes of hot and cold. But it comes with all kinds of other Robert Heinlein science fiction, for those of you guys who read Heinlein, dystopian horrors. Who's on the inside, who's on the outside? Where does this thing meet the ground? What happens when it does meet the ground? How do you get in and out? What happens if the climate... Yes, there's
Yeah, he never
just...
got super far with that, but he was
No.
designing domes of that scale. He almost built the Dodger Dome for the Brooklyn Dodgers. His company that he's working with on geodesic domes, Synergetics, was actually hired to design the Astrodome.
Right.
But then they were undercut by, it was an aluminum geodesic dome. U.S. Steel backed another company to sort of subsidize them to underbid this company to build the Astrodome, because they knew that if they built that in steel, all the other domes for stadiums would be steel. And it happened. All the other stadiums were steel domes. But he would have done that. He came close to doing some major scale. He also talked to Walter O'Malley from the Dodgers about doing something else in somewhere, in other places. What is he doing in Yonkers? I think he was going to do for the racetrack.
Yeah, the racetrack. Yeah,
But anyway, very few of them ever got built. There's a geodesic dome that Fuller built for the World's Fair in Queens. That's now the aviary at the Queens Zoo across from our museum. So you can check out one of his domes there.
Right.
And I think the biggest one
It
he built
isn't-
was it Montreal?
Montreal.
Yeah, for the expo.
Right. There was a woman over, did you have,
Okay.
sorry.
We have time for 2.
Hi, great presentation, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm curious, with all these drawings that you unearthed, did any of them come with lists of materials or indications for what they visualized as the materials?
It varies. Some drawings, like I said, we just have a postcard. So your guess is as good as
Well,
mine.
that postcard, there were a lot of newspaper
Yeah,
articles.
yeah.
Well, like
but-
the Philip Johnson drawing for the airport building and the undulating, that was Philip Johnson, right?
Yes.
So what do you think he imagined for the roof?
You know, I read this, and now I'm going to say I have forgotten precisely what materials he
You
was
were
going to
using
make
mostly
it.
newspaper articles. right?
Well, that, but he also had a write-up about it. But I believe he did have specific materials in mind for, you know, that's, the structure was going to be steel, but I don't remember what the cladding was going to be on that roof.
I think she wants to know what the written materials were. right?
But yeah, I mean, it just depends. Some of the projects, we have things that are a full set of drawings. They indicate everything.
And you have the correspondence, and you have, you know, plans that are this thick, you know, because we were at more than 30 archives across the country looking for stuff. So
Right, I mean,
it just totally runs the gamut. Sometimes you have so little, sometimes you have way too much. You know,
It's always a treasure hunt, and sometimes you turn up everything you want to find. As Sam said, you can get a, you know, drawing set that's that thick.
But also correspondence, journals, writings.
Yes.
Everything.
Yes, which tell you a lot, and then other things, you're praying even to find one more image.
Okay, I saw the hand up, so.
What's your next city?
Ooh. Sam?
Oh boy, that's a good question. We're trying to figure that out now.
Well,
If we did the United States, Chicago would be the obvious choice. But we're thinking we may, if we're going to do another city, we're also looking at Paris. Possibly, I think that kind of captures people's attention pretty quickly. And what we've looked at now is actually quite surprising in the kind of visionary schemes that you wouldn't think for Paris. So it's a good chance. And we may look at something a little bit more global. So we're open to suggestions if you have any.
So I wanted to say thank you to Sam and Greg again and the Glass House for this wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.